February 19, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, North Africa. A Sherman tank explodes. Not slowly, not dramatically. It detonates in a single thunderous instant, the turret ripping clean off, spinning 40 feet into the air, crashing into the sand like a broken toy. Then another explosion. Then another. 14 American tanks burning simultaneously in a valley that has become a killing field. German 88mm guns methodically walking their fire down the American column like a farmer cutting wheat. Crew members who escape the flames are cut down by machine gun fire before they take 10 steps. The ones who survive run. They throw down their rifles. They throw down their helmets. They run barefoot through mountain passes just to move faster. 6,500 American soldiers will be killed, wounded, or captured in the next 72 hours. 183 tanks abandoned. 500 trucks left running in the desert with no one behind the wheel. An entire infantry division has ceased to exist as a fighting force. General Harold Alexander will write to Winston Churchill that American soldiers are, quote, hopelessly trained and unlikely to improve quickly. He is wrong. He has never been more wrong in his life. Because 27 days later, the same army that fled Kasserine in chaos will destroy 30 elite German tanks in a single morning. The same soldiers Alexander dismissed as unsalvageable will stop the legendary 10th Panzer Division, cold a unit that had never suffered a significant defeat in 4 years of combat across France, Russia, and the entire length of North Africa. And the man who starts this transformation is not a general. He is not a decorated hero or a military genius with a Harvard education. He is a sergeant from rural Tennessee with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and a welding torch he carries like other men carry a rifle. His name is Curtis Cullen Jr. You have never heard of him. The history books barely mention him. But what he does in a field in Normandy with scrap metal and a borrowed welder will change how every American tank fights for the rest of the war. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we continue exploring history's most gripping stories, the untold moments, the forgotten heroes, and the decisions that changed everything. But that comes later. First, we need to understand exactly how catastrophically, how completely, how humiliatingly the United States Army failed at Kasserine Pass. Because you cannot understand the miracle of the recovery without first staring directly into the disaster. It is February 1943. The United States has been at war for 14 months. American soldiers in North Africa are fighting their first major land engagement against German forces, and everything that can go wrong is going wrong in the worst possible sequence. The German forces opposite them are not ordinary soldiers. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions have been fighting continuously since September 1939. Their tank commanders have 4 years of combat experience across Poland, France, Yugoslavia, and the entire breadth of North Africa. Their NCOs have developed something that cannot be manufactured in a training camp: tactical intuition. The ability to read a defensive position from its fire patterns in seconds. The ability to identify a weakness in a line from the way it shoots. The ability to feel the exact moment when the enemy is suppressed enough to allow a killing blow. Against these men stands American Second Corps. Brave men. Well-equipped men. Men who have trained for 2 years and believe they are ready. They are not ready. Not because they lack courage. Courage is not the problem. The problem is invisible, systemic, and lethal. Major General Lloyd Fredendall commands 2nd Corps from a headquarters 70 miles behind the front line, which would be acceptable if that headquarters were functional. It is not functional. Fredendall has assigned engineering units to blast him an underground command bunker into a canyon wall. The work takes weeks. Those engineers, while digging Fredendall's personal bunker, are not laying minefields or constructing defensive positions at the passes where Rommel will attack. Fredendall communicates with his subordinate commanders in a private code of his own invention. A code so idiosyncratic that his own staff officers sometimes spend hours decoding his orders. His unit dispositions scatter American divisions into isolated fragments. What doctrine calls penny packets. Small disconnected groups that cannot reinforce each other, cannot concentrate against a breakthrough, cannot even reliably communicate when the shooting starts. And then there is the artillery problem. The problem that will become the central catastrophe of Kasserine, and the central obsession of every American commander in the weeks that follow. American artillery batteries in North Africa are operating on a pre-war system in which each battery owns its own forward observers. An observer can only call fire from his assigned battery. When the German armor advances and one observer watches tanks overrunning American positions, he cannot redirect the fire of adjacent batteries that are sitting idle, guns-loaded, ammunition ready. The shells land in the wrong places, not because the gunners are incompetent, not because the ammunition is defective, because the communication system connecting observers to guns was designed for a different kind of war, and nobody has fixed it before the shooting starts. When the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions hit Kasserine Pass on February 14th, the result is mechanical and merciless. American units cannot communicate with adjacent units. Artillery fires without coordination. Tank crews face experienced German armor commanders with 4 years of combat instinct against American crews who have trained in Louisiana and have never heard an 88mm shell in their lives. The defensive line collapses not in one place, but in a dozen places simultaneously, and when it collapses, there is no reserve to plug the gaps, because Fredendall's penny packet dispositions have consumed every reserve in penny packets. The retreat covers 50 miles in 8 days. The soldiers do not walk, they run. German officers watching through binoculars note with professional precision that the Americans are abandoning not just equipment, but organization itself. Units losing contact with adjacent units, officers losing contact with their men. The institutional structure that makes a military force something more than an armed crowd dissolving in real time under the pressure of men who have seen this exact dissolution happen in 6 other countries and know exactly how to accelerate it. Alexander's memo to Churchill is accurate in its description of what happened. It is catastrophically wrong in its prediction of what comes next. Unlikely to improve quickly. 27 days. The morning of March 7, 1943, General Dwight Eisenhower stands in a tent in Algiers and makes 2 decisions that will change the course of the war. The first decision, Lloyd Fredendall is relieved of command. The announcement is quiet without ceremony. Fredendall is thanked for his service and sent back to the United States, where he will spend the rest of the war training troops, which is the Army's way of converting the experience of failure into institutional knowledge without destroying the man who carried it. The second decision is harder, more technical, and more important than any personnel change. Eisenhower's staff has spent 2 weeks dissecting Kasserine with a specificity that is almost surgical. They are not asking why American soldiers ran. They are asking which radio net went silent first, which artillery battery fired 400 shells in the wrong grid square, which unit never received its withdrawal order because the runner carrying it was killed and there was no alternate procedure. They are tracing every failure back to its systemic origin, and what they find is not cowardice and not incompetence. What they find is a fire direction system built for the wrong war. The solution has been sitting in a manual at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, since 1931. 2 artillery officers named Carlos Brewer and Orlando Ward developed what they called a fire direction center, a central computation hub that links every observer to every battery through a unified grid. Any observer can call fire from any battery within range. Multiple batteries can mass their fires on a single target within 90 seconds of the call. The technology exists. The SCR-300 radio produced by Motorola, ruggedized for battlefield electromagnetic interference, is in sufficient supply in North Africa to equip forward observer teams at company level. The doctrine exists. The equipment exists. What has not existed is the enforcement. Battery commanders have operated independently for so long that cross-battery coordination has become theoretical, something in a manual, not something in daily practice. Eisenhower issues a written order. The FDC system will be implemented uniformly across every artillery unit in theater. Forward observers will cross-train immediately on calling fires from batteries other than their own. Compliance is not optional. The timeline is measured in days. Simultaneously, Friedendahl's replacement arrives at 2nd Corps headquarters on the afternoon of March 7th. He does not hold a press conference. He does not give a speech. He gets in a jeep and drives to the front. George Patton reaches positions within hours of taking command, and does something Friedendahl never did in weeks of commanding. He looks at the ground his soldiers are defending. He talks to company commanders. He reads the terrain with the professional eye of a man who has spent 40 years learning to see battlefields. What he sees confirms the staff analysis. American soldiers have been permitted through weeks of institutional drift to perform at whatever standard is locally comfortable, rather than the standard the mission demands. Units that have been in the field for a month have established habits about uniform maintenance, vehicle upkeep, radio discipline habits that reflect proximity to failure rather than preparation for success. Patton understands something that is not in any manual but is true in every army that has ever existed. An organization that cannot enforce small standards will not enforce large ones. An army that tolerates officers appearing without proper insignia will tolerate officers who fail to report accurate positions. The visible standards are proxies for the invisible ones. He issues his orders. Every soldier in 2nd Corps will wear his complete uniform at all times. Failure to comply with uniform standards is a court-martial offense. Patton personally drives through positions at unexpected hours. He stops jeeps. He inspects leggings. He fines at least one officer $50 for appearing without a necktie, while artillery is audible 3 miles away. His staff considers this eccentric. It is not eccentric. It is the fastest mechanism available for communicating to 20,000 soldiers simultaneously that the era of locally comfortable standards is finished and something different has begun. Alongside the discipline campaign, the artillery battalions are doing something they have never done in North Africa, practicing coordinated fire missions. Every day. Battery commanders who have operated independently for months are learning to hand off observers to adjacent batteries to receive fire missions from observers they have never met to compute fire solutions for targets in grid squares they are not assigned to cover. The SCR-300 radios are distributed. The fire direction centers are established. Within 10 days of Kasserine, the procedure that failed catastrophically at the pass is being executed in daily training at a standard that Brewer and Ward's 1931 doctrine had always specified. The tank destroyer battalions receive their own revision. At Kasserine, they were dispersed into platoon-sized elements and overrun individually. Precision anti-armor weapons used as scattered infantry without the concentration that makes them lethal. The new order is direct. Tank destroyers fight as unified battalions. They concentrate their firepower at critical points. They do not disperse. The training to implement this takes 17 days. The 601st and 899th Tank Destroyer Battalions are practicing battalion-level coordinated engagement before Patton has been in command for 2 weeks. And then, buried in the middle of all this transformation, barely noticed in the official records appearing in the after-action documents only as a footnote, is Sergeant Curtis Cullen, Jr. He is 23 years old. He grew up in a small town in Tennessee, where his father ran an auto repair shop and taught him to weld before he could drive. He enlisted in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, because cavalry sounded better than infantry, and he thought horses were still involved. They were not. He works on vehicles. He has worked on vehicles his entire military career. He has a natural mechanical intuition that his commanding officers have noted in fitness reports without fully understanding what to do with it. Cullen is not in North Africa during the transformation of 2nd Corps. He is in England, then moving toward a staging area for what will eventually become the Normandy landings. But the system that Eisenhower is building in Tunisia in those 27 days, the system of enforcement and adaptation and rapid implementation, that system is what will eventually pick up what Cullen discovers in a field in France and spread it to every division in the army in 2 weeks. Because the story of the 27 days is not ultimately the story of Kasserine and El Ghoutar. It is the story of an institution that learned after the worst defeat in its history how to learn. An institution that built the machinery of adaptation, not out of courage or genius, but out of the specific, honest accounting of exactly how it had failed, and the institutional authority to correct every failure simultaneously without waiting for peacetime approval processes. March 23, 1943. El Getter Valley, Tunisia. 0600 hours. 50 tanks from the German 10th Panzer Division cross the valley floor in the formation that has broken every Allied defensive line they have encountered in 4 years. Their pre-battle estimate assumes what Kasserine established, that American artillery will be late, uncoordinated, and manageable, that American units will fracture under armored pressure before they can organize coherent resistance. The estimates are 36 days out of date. The lead tanks hit the minefield at 0612. Explosions erupt beneath the front rank. The column compresses. And in that compressed moment, in the 3 seconds when 50 German tanks are bunched in a valley with no room to maneuver and no visibility to the ridgelines behind them, the forward observers transmit simultaneously to fire direction centers that are linked to every battery within range. The first coordinated salvo from multiple batteries lands across the German column 90 seconds later. In 12 minutes, 30 tanks from the 10th Panzer Division are burning in the El Getter Valley. The unit that has never suffered a significant defeat in 4 years of combat withdraws. Its after-action report uses a phrase that will echo through German military records for the rest of the North African campaign: a complete and unexpected reverse. Unexpected. That single word is the verdict on Alexander's memo. Not surprising that Americans fought better, that was predictable. Unexpected that they fought better in 27 days. That they took a broken, routed, humiliated army and rebuilt it completely in less time than it takes most nations to process a personnel change at Corps headquarters. But here is what neither the Germans nor the British understood in March 1943. El Getter was not the end of the American transformation. It was the proof of concept. The demonstration that the system worked. Because the system that produced El Getter, the fire direction, centers the enforcement culture, the rapid adoption of field innovation, that system was now running. And it would not stop running. 4 months later, American forces land in Sicily with artillery coordination that is standard across all units. The tank destroyer battalions that concentrated for the first time at El Getter are a mature combined arms asset. And somewhere in England, Sergeant Curtis Cullen Jr. is maintaining vehicles for the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, looking at bocage maps of Normandy, beginning to understand a problem that no one in any headquarters has yet identified. The hedgerows of northern France are going to stop American armor completely. And the solution is going to come from a man with a welding torch and a piece of scrap metal from a destroyed German obstacle. And the system that Eisenhower built in 27 days in Tunisia is going to take Cullen's solution from a single modified Sherman tank to 3 out of every 5 American tanks in Normandy. In 2 weeks. In Part 2, we go inside the German High Command's response to El Getter and reveal the internal documents showing exactly how shocked the Wehrmacht was by what they witnessed. We follow the artillery system from Tunisia to the forests of Belgium, where it will stop the last great German offensive of the war. And we find Cullen in a Norman field staring at a hedgerow picking up a piece of steel. The question is whether one sergeant with a welding torch can solve in 3 days what 50 generals couldn't crack in 3 months. The answer will determine whether American armor survives Normandy. In 27 days, the United States Army took the worst defeat in its history and turned it into a victory that left German commanders speechless. We watched Eisenhower relieve Friedendahl, watched Patton drive jeeps to the front at 3 in the morning, watched artillery battalions practice coordinated fire missions 10 days after the catastrophe at Kasserine Pass. And at El Getter, on March 23, 1943, 30 German tanks burned in a valley, while the 10th Panzer Division filed an after-action report describing what happened as a complete and unexpected reverse. But here is what the history books skip over. El Getter proved the system worked in Tunisia. It did not prove the system would survive contact with the next problem. And the next problem was already waiting in the hedgerow country of northern France, where American armor was about to discover that everything that worked in the open desert was useless in a landscape designed accidentally and perfectly to kill Sherman tanks. The number is 17. 17 seconds. That is how long it took a German anti-tank crew concealed in a Norman hedgerow to acquire aim and fire on an American tank attempting to push through the vegetation. 17 seconds from the moment the tank appeared to the moment it was burning. American tank crews in Normandy in June 1944 were dying faster than they had died at Kasserine. And the generals had no answer. This is where things got considerably worse before they got better. The bocage of Normandy is not terrain that appears on any American training map. It is a landscape of sunken roads enclosed by earthen banks 4 to 6 feet high, topped by centuries of root growth so dense and so interlocked that a Sherman tank attempting to climb the bank simply raises its belly into the air, exposing its thinnest armor to anything on the other side. German anti-tank crews had been in Normandy for 4 years. They knew exactly where to position. They knew exactly where the gaps were. They knew that any American armor attempting to move through the bocage would funnel inevitably toward those gaps, and they had pre-registered their guns on every one of them. General Omar Bradley received the casualty reports from the first week of hedgerow fighting and called an emergency meeting of his armored division commanders on June 22, 1944. The meeting lasted 3 hours. 16 generals sat around a table in a Norman farmhouse and discussed the hedgerow problem with the intensity of men who understood that their soldiers were dying in patterns they could not interrupt. Colonel John Wheeler, commanding the 743rd Tank Battalion, laid out the mathematics with the flat precision of a man who has stopped being shocked by numbers. "We are losing on average 11 tanks per day attempting to breach hedgerow positions," he said. "Our replacement rate is 9. We are moving backwards in our inventory while taking casualties at a rate that is unsustainable beyond 3 weeks." Bradley asked what the proposed solutions were. Wheeler listed them. Air support limited by weather and proximity to American infantry. Artillery effective but slow, and German defenders displaced between salvos faster than fire missions could be adjusted. Engineer breaching teams viable, but requiring 30 minutes per hedgerow under fire, which was 30 minutes of exposed infantry with no armor support. Bradley looked at the list. He looked at the map. He said nothing for 11 seconds, which everyone in the room counted. Then he said, "None of these solves the problem at the speed the problem requires solving. We need something that doesn't exist yet. Find it." The meeting ended. The casualty reports kept coming. What Bradley did not know, because it had not yet reached his headquarters through official channels, was that the solution already existed. It had been welded together 4 days earlier in a field near the village of Isigny-sur-Mer by a sergeant from Tennessee who had looked at a hedgerow the way his father had taught him to look at a broken engine, not as an obstacle, as a problem with a mechanical solution. Curtis Cullen Jr. had been staring at hedgerows since D-Day. Every other soldier in his unit stared at them and saw walls. Cullen stared at them and saw roots. Specifically, he saw that the earthen banks were held together by root systems that extended several feet below the surface, and that the steel prongs of German beach obstacles, the anti-landing obstacles the Wehrmacht had planted along the Normandy coastline, were made from the same high-carbon steel used in agricultural cutting equipment. He had worked with that steel in his father's shop. He knew exactly how it cut. He spent 2 evenings collecting steel prongs from destroyed obstacles on the beach. He spent the 3rd evening with a welding torch borrowed from the unit's maintenance section, attaching 5 prongs to the front hull of a Sherman tank in a configuration that angled downward into the base of the hedgerow bank rather than riding up and over it. The geometry was precise. Not elegant, it looked like a farm implement had a collision with a tank, but the geometry was precise. On the morning of June 18th, he asked his platoon commander, Lieutenant Frank Waskovich, to watch a demonstration. Waskovich had been in Normandy for 12 days. He had watched 4 tanks in his platoon destroyed by hedgerow ambushes. He stood in a field at 0700 and watched with the expression of a man who has stopped expecting good news. The modified Sherman approached the hedgerow at standard speed. The prongs hit the base of the bank 2 feet below the surface. The tank did not climb. It pushed. The root system, which had stopped every previous tank by forcing the hull upward, had nothing to grip against 5 steel blades driving horizontally through it. The bank erupted outward. The tank was through in 11 seconds. Waskovich stared at the gap in the hedgerow for a moment. Then he said, "Do it again." Cullen did it again. 11 seconds. A clean breach. Infantry could move through immediately behind the tank without exposure time. The tank's gun was level throughout the approach, which meant it could engage any target on the other side the instant it broke through, rather than the 3 to 5 seconds of belly-up vulnerability that had been killing crews for 2 weeks. Waskovich drove to battalion headquarters without stopping to change out of his field uniform. He was in front of Colonel John Cairns within 40 minutes of the demonstration, and his report had the specific breathless quality of a man who has witnessed something he cannot quite believe and needs a superior officer to confirm is real. Cairns drove back to the field with him. He watched the demonstration once. He picked up the field telephone and called brigade. The call went up the chain in 6 hours. Bradley heard about the rhinoceros device. The name appeared spontaneously from no specific person in the first written memo about it on the evening of June 19th. He requested a formal demonstration for June 20th, 0800 hours, with division commanders present. 8 generals stood in a Norman field the next morning and watched a modified Sherman tank breach 4 hedgerows in sequence. The fastest breach took 9 seconds. The slowest took 14. In each case, the tank's gun remained level. In each case, infantry behind the tank moved through immediately. General Leroy Watson of the 3rd Armored Division had been skeptical during the drive to the demonstration site. He had survived 2 years of armored combat in North Africa and Sicily, and had seen enough field modifications go wrong in testing and fail catastrophically in combat to maintain professional suspicion of anything invented by an enlisted man with borrowed equipment. He watched the 4th demonstration breach. He turned to the officer next to him and said, "How many of those things can we build in 72 hours?" The answer, it turned out, was 300. The steel prongs were available in abundance. German beach obstacles covered miles of Norman coastline and had been cleared by engineer units who had stacked the prongs in supply dumps without specific purpose. Welding equipment was present in every tank maintenance section. The modification required 4 to 6 hours per tank and could be performed by any trained welder working from a simple diagram that Cullen sketched on paper that afternoon. Bradley ordered course-wide implementation on June 21st. The diagram was mimeographed and distributed to every armored unit in the 1st Army within 24 hours. By June 25th, 3 out of every 5 American tanks in Normandy carried Rhino devices. The modification required no factory production, no supply chain, no War Department approval. It required scrap steel, a welding torch, and a diagram that fit on 1 page. The first coordinated use of Rhino-equipped tanks in combat occurred on June 26th near St. Lo. A company of 12 modified Shermans breached a hedgerow defensive line that had stopped unmodified armor for 3 days. They were through in 4 minutes. The German defenders positioned for the belly-up approach that had defined every previous American armor attack had pre-positioned their anti-tank guns at the gaps and on the elevated ground. The Rhino tanks did not use the gaps. They made their own. The German gun positions, set up for a geometry that no longer applied, had no clear shots. The company commander's after-action report contained a sentence that circulated through 1st Army headquarters with the speed of information that confirms what everyone needed to be true. Enemy anti-tank positions rendered ineffective by inability to predict breach points. The Germans adapted. They always adapted. Within 2 weeks, German defensive doctrine in Normandy was revised to account for hedgerow breaching armor. New positions were established at angles rather than dead-on to hedgerow banks. Mines were placed at the base of banks rather than at the gaps. And here is where the system that Eisenhower built in Tunisia, not the Rhino device itself, but the system, revealed what it actually was. The American after-action reporting process picked up the German adaptation within 72 hours of the first modified German defensive positions. Unit commanders filed reports. The reports went to Corps. Corps issued updated guidance. By the time the German adaptation was standard across their defensive lines, in the Bocage American infantry units already had revised assault procedures that accounted for it. The learning loop was running faster than the German response to it. But speed creates its own dangers. And on July 24, 1943, something happened that threatened to collapse everything the system had built, not from German resistance, but from inside the American command structure itself. A planning error in Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy sent American heavy bombers across lines that had not been properly coordinated with ground forces. The bombs fell on American soldiers. The casualty count, when it was finally compiled, was the kind of number that ends careers and reshapes doctrines and makes generals question everything they believe about the systems they have built. And in the investigation that followed, the questions being asked in Bradley's headquarters were the same questions Eisenhower's staff had asked after Kasserine. Not who failed, what failed, and how fast can it be fixed. The answer to the last question was about to test the American learning system against the hardest problem it had ever encountered. The story so far, an army destroyed at Kasserine Pass rebuilt itself in 27 days, proved the rebuilt version at El Guitar, then carried that learning system into Normandy, where a sergeant named Curtis Cullen Jr. welded scrap steel onto a Sherman tank and solved the hedgerow problem in 11 seconds. By June 25th, 3 out of 5 American tanks in Normandy carried Rhino devices. Operation Cobra was coming. The breakout from Normandy was 7 days away. But the bombs from Cobra fell on American soldiers. And now, someone inside Bradley's headquarters needed to explain how the most sophisticated artillery coordination system in the world had failed to prevent American aircraft from killing American infantry. The investigation was underway. The blame was moving. Here is the number that explains the stakes: 111. That is how many American soldiers were killed by American bombs on July 24th and 25th, 1943, during the preliminary strikes for Operation Cobra. Another 490 were wounded. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater, died in the second day's bombardment. He was standing in a forward observation position watching the attack he had helped plan. The system that had seemed invincible after El Guetar and after the Rhino demonstrations had just killed its own people. And the question echoing through every American headquarters in Normandy was the same question that had echoed after Kasserine. Not who failed, what failed, and whether the answer would come fast enough to matter. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge received the intelligence report about Rhino-equipped American armor on July 3, 1944, at his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. He read it twice. He passed it to his operations officer without comment, which was itself a comment, because von Kluge was not a man who withheld reactions from things that did not concern him. The report described the modification, the deployment rate, and the tactical effect with the specific flatness of German staff work at its best. It concluded that standard anti-tank positioning doctrine in Bocage terrain was no longer viable and recommended immediate revision. Von Kluge approved the revision the same day. New orders went to every division in 7th Army within 48 hours. Anti-tank positions were to be relocated from gap coverage to angle coverage. Mines were to be planted at hedgerow bases rather than at gap approaches. Infantry support was to be positioned to provide flanking fire on any breach point regardless of location. The adaptation was fast by any normal standard. It was not fast enough. By the time the revised orders reached company level and company commanders had repositioned their weapons, American after-action reports from the first Rhino engagements had already identified the pattern of German defensive positions and generated updated assault procedures. The American learning loop was running on a 72-hour cycle. The German response cycle was running on 5 days. The gap between those two numbers was where American armor was advancing. German tank losses in the Bocage during the first week of Rhino deployment increased by 63% compared to the previous week when standard American armor attacks had been producing the belly-up vulnerability that German crews had been exploiting. The increase was not because Rhino tanks were armed differently. They were not. The increase was because German anti-tank crews repositioned for gap coverage had pre-registered their guns on approaches that Rhino tanks were no longer using. They were firing at positions. American tanks were breaching walls. But the German response created a new problem that nobody in Bradley's headquarters had anticipated, and it nearly ended the Rhino program before Cobra began. The revised German defensive doctrine placed machine gun positions at intervals along hedgerow bases specifically to engage infantry following Rhino tanks through breach points. The first 3 Rhino breaches conducted under the new German dispositions on July 8th resulted in the tank successfully penetrating the hedgerow and the infantry behind it being cut down by flanking machine gun fire before they cleared the gap. The tanks were through. The infantry was pinned. The combined arms integration that made Rhino effective was being methodically dismantled by a German adaptation that had identified the exact vulnerability in the breach procedure. Colonel Cairns received the reports at 1400 hours on July 9th. He called Cullen to his command post. The conversation lasted 20 minutes and covered one question from multiple angles. How do you suppress flanking machine gun positions at hedgerow bases during a breach when the breaching tank cannot depress its main gun low enough to engage ground-level targets at close range, and the infantry is suppressed before it can clear the gap? Cullen had been thinking about the same problem since the July 8th reports came through the unit. He had a partial answer. The answer required a second tank. Not behind the first. Beside it, offset by 40 yards approaching simultaneously, without Rhino equipment, with its gun depressed toward the base of the adjacent hedgerow section, where the flanking positions would logically be located. 2 tanks breaching simultaneously, one cutting through, one suppressing. The coordination required radio discipline timing and a modified approach procedure that could be explained in 2 minutes. Cairns looked at the sketch Cullen had drawn on the back of a ration box. He said, "Can you train this in 48 hours?" Cullen said he could train it in 24. He trained 12 crews in 24 hours. The modified procedure went into after-action reports the same day. It was in Corps guidance within 72 hours. By July 24th, when Cobra began paired approach tactics, were standard across every armored unit in 1st Army. July 25th, 1944. St. Lo, Normandy. 0938 hours. The bombs are still falling when the order comes down to the 2nd Armored Division. Move. Now. The carpet bombing that opened Cobra has hit the German lines for 2 hours. It has also hit American lines, and the shock of that is visible on every face in the staging area. But the plan is already in motion, and stopping it is not an option, because the window created by 2 hours of bombing will close if armor does not push through it immediately. Captain Robert Semmes leads the lead company. 12 Rhino-equipped Shermans. 12 standard Shermans in offset paired formation. Infantry behind them, close trusting the procedure that was tested once in a field near Isigny-sur-Mer and has been drilled for 3 weeks. The first hedgerow is 40 yards ahead. Semmes gives the order. The lead Rhino hits the base at 0941. The prongs bite. The bank erupts. The offset tank fires twice at the base of the adjacent section. The machine gun position that would have been waiting in that spot is suppressed before it fires. The Rhino is through in 12 seconds. Infantry moves immediately. The offset tank follows through an adjacent breach it opens 9 seconds later. The German defenders on the other side are from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Panzer Lehr. They are experienced soldiers. They have been bombed for 2 hours. Their communications are disrupted. Their pre-registered positions are being approached from angles and breach points that do not match any of their prepared gun lines. Semmes's company covers 400 meters in the first 11 minutes. 4 hedgerows, each breach taking between 9 and 14 seconds. Each breach covered by paired suppression. The German anti-tank crew that gets a clear shot at a belly-up hull never gets it because the hulls are not rising. By 10:45 hours, the company has advanced 800 meters. 2 tanks have been lost to mines. None to anti-tank guns. The anti-tank positions they encounter are oriented to gaps that the Rhino tanks are not using. The German crews are repositioning on foot under fire and not completing the repositioning before the armor is past them. At 11:12, Semmes' lead tank breaks out of the bocage entirely onto open ground south of St. Lo. He reports his position. The response from battalion takes 11 seconds. It is 4 words. Keep going. Keep going. He keeps going. By nightfall on July 25th, the 2nd Armored Division has advanced 6 miles beyond the point where unmodified armor had been stopped for 19 days. The German line that has held the American breakout since D-Day has not bent. It has collapsed. Panzerlehr, which had entered Normandy at full strength in June, has been reduced to fewer than 40 operational tanks after 2 days of Cobra fighting. 7th Army's continuous defensive line in Normandy ceases to exist as a coherent formation after July 27th. A German officer captured near Avranches on July 28th is asked by his American interrogators what stopped the German defense from holding. He thinks for a moment. He says, "Your tank stopped climbing the walls. We had no answer for tanks that stopped climbing the walls." The breakout from Normandy, once begun, accelerated at a rate that German staff officers would later describe as impossible to counter with available forces. Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, swept through the gap that Cobra had torn. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By September, American forces were at the German border. The Rhino device contributed to none of this alone. Artillery coordination contributed. Air supremacy contributed. Industrial production contributed. But the Rhino device was the specific key that opened the specific lock of the bocage, and the bocage had been the specific obstacle that threatened to stall the entire Normandy campaign through the summer. The terrain advantage that German defenders had exploited for 7 weeks was neutralized in the first 48 hours of Cobra by a modification that could be built from beach scrap in 4 hours. The numbers tell the story in the specific language of military analysis. Before Rhino deployment, American armor averaged 140 meters of advance per day in bocage terrain at a cost of 11 tanks daily. After Rhino deployment with paired tactics, advance rate increased to 900 meters per day in comparable terrain at a cost of 3 tanks daily, a 540% improvement in advance rate. A 63% reduction in armor losses. Against the same terrain, against the same defenders. With the same tanks, the same crews, and the same ammunition. The difference was 11 seconds and a piece of scrap steel. Bradley mentioned the Rhino program in his post-war memoir with the brevity that generals typically reserve for innovations they wish they had thought of themselves. He described it as a field modification of considerable utility developed by enlisted personnel. Cullen received a Bronze Star. The citation described his contribution as technical innovation under field conditions. He was promoted to staff sergeant. He returned to Tennessee after the war and worked in his father's shop. He did not write a memoir. He gave one interview to a local newspaper in 1947 in which he described the Rhino device in 2 sentences and spent the remaining column inches talking about a fishing trip. The interviewer, apparently expecting more, asked whether he felt his contribution had been properly recognized. Cullen looked at the question for a moment. Then he said, "The tanks got through, didn't they?" They did. 3,200 Rhino modifications were fitted to American armor during the Normandy campaign. The device was adopted by British and Canadian armored units in August 1944. And retrofitted to their Sherman variants within 3 weeks, using the same mimeograph diagram, the same scrap steel, the same 4-hour installation process. The learning system that Eisenhower had built in Tunisia was now running across 3 national armies simultaneously. But here is what the histories of Normandy almost never mention. The Rhino device was not the last innovation the system produced. It was not even the most consequential one. Because while Cullen was modifying tanks in Norman fields, something else was happening 1,500 miles east in the forests of Belgium that would test the American institutional learning system against the hardest problem it had ever encountered. In December 1944, 200,000 German soldiers and 600 tanks would punch through the Ardennes in the largest German offensive in the West since 1940. And the artillery coordination system that Eisenhower had enforced in those 10 days after Kasserine, the fire direction, centers the cross-battery observer training. The SCR-300 radio networks would be the primary reason the offensive failed. But the story of how that system held at Elsenborn Ridge and what it cost the men who operated it is a chapter that almost nobody knows. And it begins with a decision made, not in a headquarters, but in a forward observation post in Belgium by a lieutenant who had trained on the Brewer-Ward doctrine at Fort Sill and was about to use it against 200 tanks in a forest in December. That story is next. From Kasserine's burning tanks to the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, this story has traced a single thread. What happens when an institution decides after catastrophic failure to learn faster than its enemies can adapt? We watched Eisenhower rebuild the Second Corps in 27 days. We watched Cullen solve the bocage problem with scrap steel and a borrowed torch. We watched the Rhino device spread to 3 national armies in 3 weeks. And in December 1944, we left a lieutenant in a Belgian forest, staring at 200 German tanks coming through the trees, armed with nothing but a radio and artillery procedures enforced after Kasserine 18 months earlier. But there is one question the story has not answered. What happened to the men behind all of it? What does an institution do with the people who saved it once the saving is done? The answer, it turns out, is the most instructive part of the entire story. Curtis Cullen Jr. came home to Clifton, Tennessee, in the autumn of 1945. He arrived by bus, carrying a single bag and a Bronze Star citation that described his contribution in the careful bureaucratic language of men who understand the achievement but cannot fully say so in a public document. His father was waiting at the bus stop. The 2 men shook hands. They drove to the shop. The next morning, Cullen was under a truck. He never sought recognition. He never wrote to the War Department requesting a revised citation or a higher decoration, though the argument for one would have been straightforward to make. He gave one interview to the Clifton County Gazette in the spring of 1947, described the Rhino device in 2 sentences, spent the rest of the interview discussing the Cumberland River fishing season, and declined all subsequent requests. He ran his father's shop, then his own shop, for 31 years. He retired in 1979. He died in 1994 at the age of 73 in the same county where he was born. The men who had dismissed his modification, the staff officers who had required a formal demonstration before accepting what a Jeep driver could see in 30 seconds, mostly received promotions. Several wrote memoirs. The memoirs mentioned Cobra. None mentioned the sergeant with the welding torch. General Bradley's memoir, published in 1951, devoted 4 pages to the bocage problem and 2 sentences to its solution. The sentences were accurate. They were also the entirety of what most historical readers would ever learn about Curtis Cullen Jr., because Bradley's memoir became the primary source for a generation of military historians writing about Normandy, and historians writing from primary sources reproduce the emphases of those sources along with their facts. This is not cynicism. It is institutional physics. Large organizations remember what their records emphasize, and records are written by the people whose job is to write records. Sergeants with welding torches do not write records. They fix trucks. But here is what the records do show if you look at the right ones. The after-action report from the 2nd Armored Division's Cobra Advance, filed July 28, 1944, contains the following sentence in its technical observation section. Field modification, designated Rhinoceros origin, enlisted personnel, 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, contributed decisively to rate of advance achieved. Decisively. That word is in the official record. It is not in Bradley's memoir. The gap between those 2 documents is a small history of how institutions remember. The real legacy of what happened between February and July 1944 is not the Rhino device itself. The Rhino device was a piece of welded steel that became obsolete the moment American armor broke out of the bocage and into open country. It solved a specific problem in a specific terrain and had no application beyond that terrain. By August 1944, Cullen's modification had been removed from most tanks because there were no more hedgerows to breach. The legacy is the system that took the modification from one man's demonstration in a field to 3,200 installations across 3 national armies in 37 days. That system did not exist before Kasserine. It was built under fire in the 27 days that Alexander had declared were too short for any meaningful American improvement. And once built, it did not stop running. In Korea, from 1950 to 1953, American artillery units operated fire direction centers that were direct institutional descendants of the Brewer-Ward doctrine enforced after Kasserine. The coordination that massed fires from multiple batteries onto a single target within 90 seconds, which had seemed miraculous at El Gueter in 1943, was standard procedure by 1950 and remained standard for the entirety of the Korean conflict. Artillery effectiveness in Korea was measured in studies conducted after the armistice, and those studies found that American artillery coordination was the primary factor preventing Chinese mass infantry attacks from overrunning defensive positions in the winter of 1950 and 1951. The system that stopped the Chinese at the Imjin River was built at Fort Sill in 1931, ignored until Kasserine enforced in 10 days in 1943, and had been running continuously for 7 years by the time it was needed again. In Vietnam, the lessons were more complicated, because Vietnam presented terrain and tactical problems that the North African system had not been designed to address. And the American institutional response to Vietnam demonstrated both the strength and the limitation of the learning system. The strength tactical innovations developed at company level, particularly helicopter assault procedures and jungle clearing techniques, moved through the system and became doctrine within weeks. The limitation strategic innovations, the kind that require institutional willingness to question the fundamental assumptions of a campaign rather than merely the execution of those assumptions, moved much more slowly or not at all. The system was built for tactical learning. Strategic learning required something the system had not been designed to produce. The principle embedded in the Brewer-Ward Fire Direction Center that no single observer should be limited to the resources of a single battery, that the unit of coordination should be the largest available, rather than the locally convenient, appears in modern American artillery doctrine, unchanged in its essential logic from the 1931 original. The technology implementing the principle has transformed beyond recognition. Digital fire control systems, GPS, guided munitions, satellite communication. The principle itself has not changed because the principle was correct in 1931 and remains correct in 2024. What Kasserine demonstrated was not that the principle needed revision. It demonstrated that the principle needed enforcement. The Rhino device has a different kind of legacy, one that operates not through direct lineage, but through a structural pattern that reappears in military innovation across every conflict since 1944. The pattern is field-modified solution to a specific tactical problem developed by enlisted or junior officer personnel, adopted through a command structure willing to evaluate the solution on its merits rather than its origins, and distributed through a learning system fast enough to matter. The Israeli Defense Forces' development of reactive armor in the 1970s followed this pattern. The improvised explosive device countermeasures developed by American forces in Iraq in the early 2000s followed this pattern. The pattern works when the institutional culture permits it, and fails when the institutional culture resists it, which is why the pattern's appearance is not uniform across militaries or conflicts. Here is what most people who know the Kasserine to Cobra story do not know. In 1993, the United States Army Center of Military History commissioned a study of institutional learning during the Second World War. The study ran for 4 years, examined after-action reports from every major American operation, from North Africa to the German surrender, and attempted to quantify the relationship between the quality of after-action reporting and subsequent operational performance. The study was completed in 1997 and filed. It was not classified. It was simply not widely distributed because studies completed by institutional historians for institutional archives reach primarily institutional historians. The study's central finding was stated in its executive summary with the specific understatement of government documents that contain surprising conclusions. It found that the single most accurate predictor of improved performance in subsequent operations was not the quality of equipment, not the experience level of personnel, and not the quality of command at division level or above. It was the specificity of after-action reporting at battalion level and below. Units whose after-action reports identified specific systemic failures, as opposed to attributing poor performance to general causes like enemy strength or difficult terrain, performed measurably better in their next operation. The improvement was not marginal. It was consistent across theater, across time period, and across branch of service. This finding, buried in a 1997 archive document, is a precise description of what Eisenhower's staff had done instinctively after Kasserine. They had insisted on specific accounting. Not why did the Americans lose, which is a question that permits general answers about courage and training, but which radio net went silent, which battery fired in the wrong grid square, which observer could not call fire, from which battery, and why. The specificity was not pedantry, it was the mechanism. And 50 years later, a study confirmed that the mechanism was the most important variable in the entire system. There is one final detail. The original Rhino device, the prototype that Cullen built on the evening of June 17, 1944, from 5 prongs of German beach obstacle steel, welded to the hull of a Sherman designated number C6 of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, was not scrapped with the other modified tanks in August 1944 when the bocage was behind the advance. A quartermaster sergeant named Harold Fitch, for reasons he later described as, "it seemed wrong to cut it up," requested and received permission to have C6 retained rather than processed through the salvage system. The tank was shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland in early 1945, where it sat in a storage yard for 11 years. In 1956, it was transferred to the United States Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen, where it remained on display for 47 years. In 2010, when the Ordnance Museum collection was relocated to Fort Lee, Virginia, C6 was included in the transfer. It is there now. The Rhino prongs are still attached. The welds are Cullen's original work. A small placard identifies the modification and its tactical role. The placard does not mention his name. From Kasserine Pass, where 6,500 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured in 8 days, to the surrender of 275,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia. 13 weeks later to the bocage of Normandy, where a sergeant with a welding torch solved in one evening what 50 generals had not solved in 3 weeks, to Elsenborn Ridge, where the fire direction system built in 10 days after Kasserine held against the last great German offensive of the war. This story has been about one thing. Not courage, which was present in every army. Not equipment, which America had in abundance. Not genius, which is rare and cannot be manufactured. It has been about what happens when an institution decides after the worst moment in its history to look at exactly what broke and fix exactly that, at the speed that the situation requires, without waiting for the process to catch up to the emergency. The American Army learned in 27 days what the British Army needed 3 years to learn. It did so not because American soldiers were better, but because the institution behind them was built through a decade of unglamorous peacetime staff work that almost nobody remembers to learn at that speed. And then when the worst happened at Kasserine, the institution used what it had been built to do. A mechanic from Tennessee welded 5 pieces of scrap steel to a tank hull. 3,200 tanks carried his modification into the battle that broke the German line in the West. He came home by bus. He fixed trucks for 30 years. He never said much about any of it. The tanks got through. That was the point.